Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar tonight. As you're coming in, make sure to introduce yourself in the chat. Make sure that your chat settings are defaulted to everyone so that we can make sure and share out where everybody's joining us from. We're super excited to be here tonight. Let's see. Oh, Chelsea, San Diego. Let's see where everybody else is joining us from. I'm joining us from Virginia. We've got Tina's from Michigan. Oh, lots of Michigan, Detroit, Florida. Make sure everybody has changed their setting to everyone. We've got a lot of people from Fort Lauderdale, St. Louis. Hi, Rosemary. Let's see, Yvonne. Lots of our Broward friends. Welcome. As you're coming in, just make sure to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to see where you're joining us from. Will, I see you've got your hand raised. Just make sure you change your default setting and put to the chat. If you have a question, just comment in the chat and we can help get get that question answered for you. I'm gonna give people just another few seconds to get in here. Hi, Mitch. Let's see, who else do we have? Hi, Chris. Yeah, you are. Oh, your your Florida friends are not enjoying snow. I think that the South Florida, Fort Lauderdale folks didn't get snow, but I did see a lot of snow up in the northern part of Florida, though. Yeah. Hollywood, Florida. Welcome. Hi, Bruce. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Again, I just wanted to say thank you and welcome to our webinar for tonight. My name is Dalton Savage, and I am one of the education coordinators here at the National Council for History Education. We so appreciate you. We value teachers and really appreciate all that you do. I'm joined by my colleague, Chelsea Gutierrez. She says welcome as well. And then we may have other staff members on here too. I don't know. I haven't seen anybody in the chat, but if you're here, thank you for being here. I do want to take just a second to kind of talk about the process for tonight. So we do have a Q&A period. If you would, and you have questions throughout, just make sure that you comment in the Q&A, and then Chelsea will be going through the Q&A later on. And then we do have an exit survey. Please help us by answering the exit survey so that we can make sure that our webinars, you're benefiting from them. So tonight's webinar explores the opportunities of 3D scanning and print technologies, what they bring to place-based education and the history classroom. We're joined by our speaker, Dr. Grant Miller, an associate professor at Southern Illinois University and the director of the Educating with Evidence project. He's going to share insights and strategies for using material culture, GIS maps, primary sources, arguments to engage your students in historical thinking. He's going to focus on Miller Grove, a free African American community with ties to the Underground Railroad. So again, really excited to have Grant here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Grant.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, I think that you should hopefully be able to see my screen there. And let me get started with, of course, my name is Grant Miller. Of course, I am at the School of Education here in Southern Illinois. So I'm in Carbondale, Illinois. You'll see my email address there at the bottom. So feel free to send any questions if we don't get those addressed in the Q&A that'll happen at the last 10 minutes of this session. Please feel free to email me with any questions that you have. Also, I'm proud to say that our project here is part of the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources. So we are a consortium member, and this project has been created in part through funding from the Library of Congress. And so I'm excited to share with you several things that we have here. Just a reference to the website. So this is our Educating with Evidence website, where you'll find all of these materials, plus several other projects that we've been doing throughout our time with the Library of Congress, including over 140 primary source assessments, a lot of place-based history resources, some of the 3D scanned artifacts that you'll be seeing here tonight. And also our newest piece is looking at using H5P technologies or HTML5 technologies to create interactive modules. I'll highlight here, you'll see URLs at the bottom of a majority of the pages that I'll be presenting to you, and I believe that a version of the slideshow will be made available for you, and you can click on any of those links that will take you directly to either resources that I'm highlighting or even interactive modules that we have on our website, or even direct links to the artifacts that we've 3D scanned that you can then 3D print. Because I know several of you, in fact, for part of the project, are already getting into 3D printing, which is very, very exciting. All right, well, with that underway, as mentioned earlier, I'm going to be utilizing a case study of Miller Grove, an African American community in southernmost Illinois that is now abandoned, but it has suspected ties to the Underground Railroad. And I want to show how all of these kind of concepts around that image of Abby Miller and her family who lived in Miller Grove, I want to show how those concepts are integrated into this case study. So even though you might not be teaching US history, you might not be teaching what you feel like is, and I've honestly have used this curriculum at the elementary, middle, and high school level at various versions of it. But even though you might not feel like you're going to be teaching this topic, at the end of this session, I do want to unpack all 5 of the concepts that you see there, just to give you some strategies and skills to see how historiography can be part of your curriculum. Citing evidence to support a claim, GIS maps, material culture, of course, using artifacts, and obviously thinking about place-based education. So again, the point being is, even though you might not be doing this unit per se, you may come away with just some skills and strategies for citing evidence to support a claim. But I want you to see how all 5 of these are integrated into this case study, into this curriculum that we have available. So when starting this curriculum and looking at what we're exploring with Miller Grove, we really wanted to get around this idea of, to what extent was the Underground Railroad in Southern Illinois? Is there evidence that supports it being there, or even evidence that supports it not being here? Were there obstacles? Were there opportunities? And one thing that I highlighted here in my critical or essential question is starting it with, to what extent? I think that that's a really nice way to give students kind of a continuum or a variety of answers to that essential question. Instead of just saying, was the Underground Railroad here? Just to what extent was it? And so we have kind of like an opportunity for some flexibility, some wiggle room. And I use that quite often in the essential questions that I create. Well, I want to start with then a little bit of historiography, a little bit of the history of the Underground Railroad. And here is an 1898 map of Underground Railroad routes that William Wilbur Seibert created. And I want to highlight what you see here circled in blue. That is southernmost Illinois. And all of these red lines are what he had documented over 100 years ago as being routes on the Underground Railroad. You'll notice that in contrast to southern Indiana, and especially southern Ohio, southern Illinois, or at least southernmost Illinois, other than this little spot here by Chester, kind of a little bit somewhat close to St. Louis, this is pretty empty. So William Seibert's argument is, wasn't there. It was much farther north, or it was much more active in places like southern Indiana or southern Ohio. But if we look at more recent scholarship, and this is a great book that focuses more on Ohio with this front line of freedom. And this is by Keith Griffler. And Keith Griffler proposes this argument that I've highlighted for you. And I want to kind of start at the bottom, what I've highlighted, and move to the top. Talked about white abolitionists being the rear guard of the Underground Railroad. Noting that African Americans and African American communities, however, were more of the frontline operatives. But however, African American frontline operatives and the white abolitionists who were in that rear guard were really a disjointed resistance network. They were not in coordination with each other. But those African Americans, and that what I have highlighted for you at the top, they were in that more intensive frontier, if you will, or that more intensive front line of the Underground Railroad. But then I wanted to kind of explore that and look at that with students in terms of, what did that mean? What does that more intensive frontier look like? That's when we can get into then some primary sources from the Library of Congress. And in fact, looking at the Chronicling America website with ability to search millions of pages of newspapers digitally to find information about what was going on in southernmost Illinois. And here is something that unfortunately and quite tragically was very common in southernmost Illinois. If anything, southernmost Illinois had the reputation of having almost a reverse Underground Railroad. And what I mean by that, in this article from the Vermont Phoenix that was published in kind of like through an Associated Press, if you will, these stories were repeatedly published in a lot of similar newspapers. But the title of it is Child Stealing at the North. And here we have children ages 18, 17, 9, and 5, African American children who were kidnapped from their father in broad daylight. In fact, he was tied up and they were then kidnapped and sold into slavery. You had that happening quite often where there was a lot of kidnappings that were happening in southernmost Illinois. And those individuals, even if they were never born into slavery, were sold into slavery during this time period. So it was a very dangerous time period. Now I want to integrate a primary source with a GIS map that we created. And I have southernmost Illinois now here circled in red. And what I've turned on this GIS map are locations of these incidents of violence. And those are with those kind of pistol icons, if you will. And you notice that there are quite a few of them. A lot of these incidents, like I said, were happening quite often. And that's, I think, the power of not only just seeing these on a newspaper article and collecting those, but then to be able to see the locations of these spatially. What I really like about this also when I've taught this with students is then I like them to pause and then make a prediction. We know there are African American communities in Illinois. Given these incidents of violence, where do you think they were? And students will, of course, quite often make the prediction that these African American communities were up to the north. They were not in these areas of danger. So then that's where we can turn on, and you can see here, as I've mentioned before, whenever you see these little links at the bottom, you can go directly to this interactive GIS map where you can turn on and off all of these layers of data that you see here. So like I said, they predict that they're up here. So then I'm able to turn on that layer of those locations. And in fact, here are where those African American communities were located. All along, in fact, here's one up north of St. Louis, quite a bit north, but notice the pattern here along Missouri and Kentucky. And that's really important because Missouri and Kentucky, of course, as you know, were border states, meaning they did not secede from the Union. So they stayed part of the Union, but they did continue to have enslaved persons. They were slave states. And so that's where Griffler's argument is talking about this front line of freedom. These African American communities intentionally settled in this intensive front line to support the Underground Railroad. But very little of that as far as that being noted in history, that's really absent. You'll see it more in oral history traditions where these stories are presented and other examples of that as well. In fact, from a historical archaeologist's perspective, they'll say, I can show you evidence why this was kept secret, versus a traditional historian would say, the Underground Railroad wasn't there. Show me the primary source that says, hey, we had the Underground Railroad or we were supporting freedom seekers. But then we get into another incident or a level or layer of data on our GIS maps that gets it a little bit interesting as far as like, well, how maybe active could it have been in southernmost Illinois with freedom seekers? Now, I don't want you to misinterpret these lines to me that these show where somebody here in, let's say, the Carolinas traveled all the way to southernmost Illinois to cross the Ohio. What these represent instead is from this book right here, taking freedom seeker advertisements or runaway advertisements and noting where they originated, and all of these were published in Shawneetown. So it shows, even just with these advertisements, the incredible amount of attention that was given to southernmost Illinois. Meaning, if you see so-and-so, this is a description of the individual. This person is a runaway slave, a freedom seeker, and of course, to return them to. And of course, they give, of course, where they are as far as the enslaved holder, the enslaver. So that's another interesting layer of data as well, in terms at least it shows the opportunities for there being an Underground Railroad here. Again, not a traditional primary source, but something that gives us some interesting layers of data. And I'll talk about more GIS maps and relating to that here toward the end of the conversation in the presentation. But let's take a little bit of a closer look at one of those communities. Now I want to kind of transition from talking about primary sources like the newspaper article to then the GIS maps to then getting into historical artifacts. And here we want to take a closer look at Miller Grove now. And in fact, that is one of these communities that you see here that's highlighted in green. And here we've done several digs there, we meaning Southern Illinois University, through the Center of Archaeological Investigations. That's what I absolutely love as being, and I guess I didn't mention earlier, I coordinate the history education program here for our undergraduates. And so what I absolutely love about having the opportunity here at Southern Illinois University is being at a research institution where I get access to these primary sources as well as these artifacts that we can 3D scan. So here is a dig site at Miller Grove, and as you can see here where they're plotting, and in fact, you'll see here several years ago, my daughter even got to join us on one of these digs, and that's her right there. So what was life like there? What was going on in these communities that were on this front line of basically this intensity, this front line of freedom? That's where then we can look at some examples of artifacts to kind of reveal a little bit more about life in Miller Grove. So here you'll see a link to our interactive module where students go through looking at 4 different artifacts. And in fact, you can go and I'll show you the link to the website later on. These are those artifacts that have been 3D printed from, of course, their original 3D scanning. So here's another one that you can see here as well, and so forth. So the process here is now using artifacts with the skill of citing evidence to support a claim. An incredibly, incredibly important skill that you'll see quite often showing up, whether you're utilizing this with political cartoons, utilizing it with traditional print-based sources, or in this case here, utilizing it with an example of artifacts or material culture. So through this process, through this module, essentially what students do is they click on the individual artifact, and then they're given primary sources over here. And you can see a kind of a series of these, whether it be an advertisement for a Colt pistol, a picture of a family, an African-American soldier from World War I, or even a patent drawing for a pistol. And I know that these are really small potentially on your screen, but when the students are in the module, they can click on any of these plus buttons to get a larger view of the actual primary source itself. And the goal for them then is to identify what this is and what evidence supports their claim about what this item is. Here we have, of course, a Star revolver, which is just a portion of it, which is a pistol. Over here, we have a piece of a porcelain doll boot. Here in the bottom left-hand corner, we have kind of a harness hook, if you will. Kind of looks like a belt buckle on this part, but then you have a hook on the end of it. And here you can already begin to see maybe the power of having these 3-dimensionally available as well. The hook part that you see on this is a bit lost in the smaller image itself. And then finally, we have an example of a toiletry bottle, perfume type bottle, and so forth. So again, what is happening in this case is that students are going through all of these artifacts. They make a claim about what it is. This is a Star revolver. They cite evidence to support that claim. So you see right here, they're going to use this patent drawing because in fact, this is the patent drawing for the Star revolver. And then they're going to justify that. Why does this evidence support your claim that this is a revolver? And in fact, what's interesting through this process is students kind of doing some inductive, deductive reasoning, if you will, because for instance, to help them with justification, I'll say, well, why didn't you use this caliber Colt pistol advertisement for your claim? Here they have to further justify why this image versus this one up here. And what students will note is on this revolver, they see this barrel chamber, this kind of round cylinder part that they also notice in the patent drawing. Again, an incredibly important way to help students think about how they would justify what their claim is or what evidence supports their claim about this being a pistol. I'm spending a little bit more time on this page because the other thing I want to note is it's interesting that I've had teachers reach out to me and say that they use this unit as an intervention unit for students who appear to be struggling with this skill of citing evidence to support a claim. In other words, it's interesting that they found that citing evidence to support a claim with something concrete that you can hold kind of helps their students think about what that skill means, what they're doing with that skill, and so forth. Then, after they've used evidence here to support their claim about what the artifact is, we get into now using the artifacts to support their claim about what we found. Here you see an outline drawing of the foundation of where we did this dig site. And I'll go back to this drawing right here. We're right there in this spot. So you can see there's very little evidence left of the cabin or the structure that was there. The only reason, and you can see this little bump out right here, the only reason that we know that there was a chimney there is because over kind of to its side is a giant pile of rubble where that chimney had collapsed. So these are different units, and this is the foundation that they found for that structure. And so now, whereas students on the previous activity used evidence like a photograph or a pattern drawing to support their claim about what the artifact is, now they're going to use their artifacts to identify what is this? What was the structure that we found? Was it a soldier's fort? Was it, and in fact, a schoolhouse? Because here is a piece of slate board that we found. A piece of slate board that would have come from a small little piece of like a chalkboard, like a small individual chalkboard. And that's really significant because Miller Grove at the time of the 1850s, an all African American community, hired a teacher. That's really significant because a majority of the neighboring white communities in southernmost Illinois were illiterate. In contrast, Miller Grove hired a teacher. So was it the schoolhouse that we found? Or was it actually a family's home? So then students go through the process of, in H5P technology, the artifacts are here and they can drag those down to kind of help them think through, like the pistol. Okay, maybe that would be at a soldier's fort. And the pistol, maybe not at a school, but then they drag it over here. Maybe that would be in a family's home. The doll leg, probably not here. I don't know if students would or take a doll maybe to school, but I definitely would maybe think of seeing a doll leg at a family's home. The bottle, might see it in a soldier's fort, might see it in a family's home, and so forth. And so they go through this process of helping them think through, okay, if it was a schoolhouse, we would probably find maybe more examples of what might be in a typical school. Maybe instead of one piece of slate board, we might find a lot of pieces of slate board. In contrast, if it was a soldier's fort, yes, we did find a pistol, but maybe we'd find more things like, brass buttons, or we'd find, and again, what I'm kind of giving you kind of a highlight of are the conversations that I hear learners engaging with when they're trying to make the decision about what this structure is. So then they finally will talk about it being a family's home. And in fact, it was Abby Miller's home. That is what this structure was and what we found. So what's nice about this is, again, we're still citing evidence to support a claim, but now we're using the artifacts to make a claim about what this structure is. Two different ways that are related to using artifacts in the classroom, but to really getting after that essential skill in the social sciences and actually in all of your disciplines, quite frankly. So that's where we're citing evidence to support a claim. As I mentioned earlier, I want to go back now into highlighting these concepts. As you can see, this Miller Grove unit takes advantage of focusing on place-based education, focusing on historiography, or I'll go into more of historiography and exactly defining that in a moment, citing evidence to support a claim, GIS maps, and looking at material culture or artifacts in the classroom. So like I said, even if you're not doing anything specifically with this curriculum, with Miller Grove, there may be some opportunities that you find that you want to utilize looking at just thinking more deeply about place-based education, or thinking more deeply about using artifacts in your classroom, or thinking more deeply about citing evidence to support a claim. That's this next part that I want to kind of now, where you saw Miller Grove being a combination of all of these concepts. Now I want to kind of take them apart and look at them individually. The first piece is place-based education. And I think a lot of you are, in fact, already doing quite a bit of an emphasis on place-based education, which is really exciting. I know NCHE has several projects looking at place-based education, whether it be rural locations or other locations as well. And something that I found very helpful is, in fact, outside of the social sciences, but I think it's very much related here. And that is looking at the Teton Science School's disciplines or our design principles, excuse me, of place-based education. I really like this as a framework when I'm thinking about how to include, to incorporate, to really focus on place-based education. One is just the local to the global context. And I'll talk a little bit more about this concept when we get into the next slide. Learner-centered, making sure that what we're looking at is relevant to our students, making it inquiry based with kind of essential questions or inquiry based questions. And of course, that's something that you're seeing in quite a few different areas of school. So thinking about how to create those questions. I'll get into historiography here when I talk about creating those questions. Design thinking. In fact, this is kind of interesting where we might think about, well, design, is that something more in the sciences, traditional sciences? Honestly, when we've done design thinking, when we're looking at making a meaningful impact on our communities, I've worked with students to create a museum display. And in fact, what we did simply was taking hollow core doors that you can buy at any hardware store and making stands for those and putting posters that we printed out of a very large kind of like printer that can do posters and creating a museum display. We did a lot of that focus on emphasizing the 1937 flood, which was a major event here in southernmost Illinois because we're at the confluence of the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. And so that was a huge impact. And so creating an exhibit that then the community could come and see, which was the students designing and looking at ways that they could implement that design into a museum display. By the way, that was super fun to then take advantage of local history museums and to talk to their exhibit designers to give students some really great information about thinking about creating their own exhibits. Simple design concepts like the people saying only use 3 different types of fonts in your display. Do a font that is no smaller than 22 point in terms of its font scale for accessibility. Again, very simple but important design-based kind of ideas to help students think about what do professionals in this area do when they're creating a museum exhibit and to utilize those concepts as well. That's kind of the same idea when we're thinking about the community as classroom and emphasizing, of course, thinking about how our community is part of a larger kind of ecosystem, if you will, thinking about how they can expand that definition and exploration of what's happening locally to more globally, as we saw here. And then finally, interdisciplinary. I want to emphasize this quite a bit here, in fact. I teach social science methods courses, and it's interesting for my pre-service teachers, my teacher candidates, when I ask them about social studies, I got the comment last week, which I thought was really interesting. One of my teacher candidates said, social studies, I feel like is something we talk about in elementary and middle school, but not in high school. Meaning in high school, they take a world geography class, or they take an economics class, or they take a, US history or a political science class where the disciplines are separated. But in middle school is the great opportunity, and quite honestly, at any level, is the great opportunity for the social sciences to be interdisciplinary. Right now, I'm working with one of the districts that I have a partnership with, and they are trying to create more of a focus on economics and geography in an 8th grade curriculum in their classroom. And what they originally wanted to do is to do the typical, we'll do an 8-week unit on geography, and then we'll do an 8-week unit on economics. And that's again kind of like going into that high school approach of where we'll have a separate class for these disciplines, but thinking about how to make those interdisciplinary. So in fact, one of the units that we're going to create that is not 8 weeks economics, 8 weeks of geography, but instead case studies. One is on the history of trains. Because with trains, we get into later on issues around labor history, think about the Pullman strike. With trains, we get into geography. and we get into the argument of whether or not to do canals in the US versus trains. Canals were a huge inspiration from what was going on in England. But in the US, thinking about the topography, canals were not as feasible, other than things like you would see with the Erie Canal, some of the more famous ones. And we also get into issues around government because then we start having train tracks that are built across state lines. So that interstate trafficking, how to regulate that, how to think about that in terms of boundaries. Focusing on a unit, a 4-week unit on the history of trains gets us into an interdisciplinary approach in the social sciences instead of an 8-week unit on geography, an 8-week unit on economics, etc. Oh, and also, by the way, because we do a lot with 3D printing here as well, and we have an imagination lab, like a makerspace, innovations. And so we'll be looking at different things in terms of innovations in the social sciences as it relates to trains. Anyway, I just wanted to highlight that point quite a bit there in terms of the interdisciplinary approach, because I think it gives us a chance to really have the social sciences talk to each other, if you will. And I'm sure a lot of you are already doing some great things related to that as well. Continuing with place-based education, think of the funnel. In fact, these are just two basic approaches to considering ways to look at place-based education. And one simple one is maybe the larger international or national context is what you introduce. And then you focus more on the local in terms of like, to what extent was that similar in terms of what was happening here? In the case of Miller Grove, we could see, of course, other historians are arguing that there's a lot going on in Indiana and southernmost Ohio with the Underground Railroad. Well, let's look at that locally then if we think about that funneling down to southern Illinois. How does it compare? Or we can just flip that funnel where the beginning of your unit, the beginning of your focus is introducing something local and then looking at how that might compare to the larger national or international scale. I want to show you that second example with a project that we're currently doing with the Library of Congress, and we'll be presenting more of this in St. Louis at the National NCHE annual conference. And that is, again, thinking about, and I've just turned it on its side, but starting with the smaller local focus and then looking at how it compares nationally. In this case, it's just the nature of the number of sources. And what we're looking at here is around 1905. Now, a lot of you probably already know about the Klansman or Birth of the Nation movie, silent movie that came out in the 19-teens. Prior to that, though, was a play called The Klansman. And it came out around 1905 and toured the nation. What's interesting about that, and something that is in that hidden history that is part of our grant that we're focusing on, is the incredible amount of protests in terms of the civil action against the playing of that play. So here in Cairo, Illinois, spelled like Cairo, but we pronounce it Cairo in southernmost Illinois, you see the African American population protesting in 1905, the play being produced. To what extent it was somewhat successful, but it had a lot of kind of, challenges with that protest and trying to make it known. What's nice is, though, you see kind of like some documentation of those protests happening. And again, looking at activism, agency, and that's really exciting to see even as early as of course, 1905. Thinking about that funnel, then, we start with this example. Then we want to look at a broader sense. To what extent, because it was a play that traveled nationally, to what extent do we see protests, African Americans protesting this play in other locations? And here we see Pennsylvania, here we see North Carolina, and here we see mentioned in a Texas newspaper talking about the hopes that this play will go and become a major Broadway production in New York. And so again, it's a great opportunity for a compare and contrast. We have a couple of sources locally, not a ton, but we can then compare those few sources to a much more larger national scale. So that's what I mean about the funnel, kind of helping think about these ways in terms of pinpointing different issues, whether it be we introduce that or we look at it later on. Historiography. This is a critical point in terms of creating those essential questions, because I guess I'll do the heart symbol. That's the critical piece of essential questions. What are historians arguing about this topic? Historians are not arguing about who fired the first shot at the Battle of Lexington. They just aren't. They don't really focus on that. They're looking at other issues related to the American Revolution. But when we want to get back into like things with the Underground Railroad or other topics, what are historians arguing about these topics? So in this case, what we're emphasizing here, and I have a couple of books here. This one's kind of a little bit faded, but this one's called The Geographies of Resistance, and it's focusing on southernmost Illinois and the Underground Railroad. Here's that Griffler Frontline of Freedom. And what I want to give you is a trick. Something that I learned as a graduate student, a master's student in history. When I had to do my final examinations, my kind of like where I had to do sit in a room and do hours of writing about a question, I was given a list of books that I was responsible for knowing the arguments of those books, the content of those books, and so forth. And that's about 50 to 75 books. I'm going to go ahead and let you in on a secret. I did not read all 75 of those books. In fact, I was encouraged not to, but I was encouraged instead to look at book reviews related to those books. So here is our contrast. Books, this one, Frontline of Freedom, is 169 pages. LaRoche's book is 232 pages. In contrast, one book review is 3 pages. And a really good book review will give you the historiography of the topic. What I mean by that is a good book review is not going to be your simple little summary of what is in the book and it was a pleasure to read and boy, I could curl up with it in front of a fire on a cold winter's night. Case in point, if you're at least farther in the north of the US right now, our Florida friends are hopefully not experiencing too much cold. But a good book review, instead of doing that, is going to give you some clues about this individual book's contribution to the historiography of the topic. In other words, it may say, this book on John Brown is really not contributing anything new to our ideas. It's just kind of talking about some issues and some bringing up some arguments that we've been in the literature focusing on for years now. In contrast, or in contrast to that, it may say this is presenting some brand new ideas about John Brown, or this is really kind of challenging our previous notions about John Brown, or in this case, our previous notions about the Underground Railroad. And so it's giving us more to think about and still need to kind of consider these issues. That's why, by the way, and I guess what I should have put on here is a visual as well, and I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this approach also, but the word history and past are not synonyms. Past is what happened. We can't change the past. History is an argument about the past. And so history is constantly changing. In fact, a great example of that is this resource by Kyle Ward, History in the Making. And basically, Kyle Ward takes all of these US history topics and gives you excerpts from history books from the past, like 200 years ago to the present. So in other words, what does a textbook from 1850 say about slavery? Does a textbook from 1911 maybe say something different about slavery in the United States? What about a textbook from 1966 and so forth? That's a good example of the historiography of a topic, or in this case, of course, the history of the history. So like I said, I would encourage you when you're thinking about just getting a sense of what are some of the arguments in my topic, getting a book review and just simply typing in, as you see here, Underground Railroad and reviews. Now this is through JSTOR. All of you graduated from a teacher education program or are near a library. Libraries have access to JSTOR where you can get these PDFs for free. I would hazard a guess that a vast majority of you are near a library where you could get access to this. So when you go into JSTOR, or you may even find the reviews you're trying to get access to are already available for free as PDFs. So just click on reviews and type in the topic, and then you'll get book reviews on your actual topic itself. And that can help with getting some of these essential questions. Again, that's what helped me. That's what helped me kind of uncover some of these topics and looking more at this hidden history, because historians are now starting to argue and talk about these recent issues. Integrating GIS maps. This is a piece that you saw earlier where I tried to look at these incidents of violence with those little pistol icons and then kind of corroborate or can kind of look at that in newspaper articles as well. So really integrating GIS with primary sources from the Library of Congress or other resources as well. It's nice to see these elements spatially, just to see maybe the frequency or the pattern of where these incidents may have occurred, but then to kind of more personalize it, to not just see it spatially, but to see it kind of more, maybe, if you will, on the emotional level, to really get a sense of what happened at one of those locations. This is where I feel like primary sources like newspaper articles are really nicely dovetailed with GIS maps. And you'll see that there are tons happening out there with GIS maps. The one that I highlighted is what we created for this unit. But you'll see here, for example, this was one of the webinars I participated in, an NCHE webinar on local place-based education for rural educators. And they presented this website, and you can see the URL here, where James Gregory has created over 139 interactive GIS maps on a variety of topics and social movements in the US. Lots of great exploration and fun to see here. Esri, which is, of course, where GIS maps, in fact, you can see the little branding of Esri right here because that's the programming software we use to create this map. But Esri has what are called story maps, and you can find tons of story maps, and this is a good example of one that talks about locations of Civil War battles. And what's really cool about this is down below, you can see my little slider here. So I'm just looking at Civil War battles from basically the very end of 1861 through the end of 1862. So really, essentially, looking at battles in 1862. And here you see them located. And it's fascinating to see the progression and the movement of these different battles. You can see if it was a Confederate victory, a Union victory, and so forth. But again, to be able to look at this spatially and to look at a lot of information and to notice patterns versus just memorizing facts about your three big significant battles during the Civil War. Again, an incredibly, incredibly invaluable tool to look at these issues spatially. Citing evidence to support a claim. Wow, this is something that I think that you could take away and utilize in anything that you are creating if you have not already. And that is simply making a claim. This is a star revolver. What evidence supports your claim? This patent drawing of the star revolver. And why? Here, we found that we needed to really create for students who were struggling with thinking about what it means to cite evidence to support a claim and to even how to justify or to provide reasoning. We created sentence starters. Artifact 1 is a star revolver. The evidence that supports my claim is a patent drawing from 1864. Why? Because I noticed that both have this distinct chamber that is kind of like the barrel or the cylinder that would have held the bullets. So that is citing evidence to support a claim. And here you can even see it with a political cartoon. This is a famous cartoon or infamous political cartoon from 1909 arguing against women's suffrage. And here we did a little bit of a different piece. We didn't have students make a claim, we gave them the claim. This 1909 cartoon is against women getting the right to vote. Cite two pieces of evidence from the image that supports your claim. And here you can see where students created those. And so in a lot of cases, we even created scoring guides. My method students will create these on a variety of topics, whether it be a political cartoon, whether it be a meme from social media, whether it be a song, whether it be whatever format you could find. Honestly, as long as it's a source that's making an argument, that's going to be something where you can have students cite evidence to support a claim. Your colleagues in the sciences, these claim reasoning evidence posters, I see these in tons of science classrooms. And so what's nice is when I've worked with districts and social studies teachers, they've noted like, oh, they're already talking about this in English language arts. They're already talking about this in science. And of course, you guys are probably already talking about it in the social science classroom. And so, or history classrooms. And so that is a skill that can go across disciplines within the social sciences and outside of the social sciences. And my goodness, it's kind of hard to think about what kinds of sources you couldn't use with citing evidence to support a claim. I'm going to close then with the last concept, and that is looking at material culture. You want to think like an archaeologist when you're looking at material culture, and that is using the mundane, or in The Small Things Forgotten, which is a famous book on material culture. And that is thinking about these mundane things in their context. Think about this piece of slate board once again. And here you see the actual photograph of that piece of slate board here, that kind of piece of chalkboard. By itself, if I were to just find that in the woods or find that at a site, it just looks like a piece of maybe potential trash, right? It just looks like a piece of slate, a piece of debris, kind of insignificant. This shard of slate then, as I mentioned earlier, becomes incredibly invaluable in its context. Because, as you heard from earlier, Miller Grove hired a teacher. They had a school. So now this little piece of mundane whatever is incredibly significant. The other piece is this porcelain doll leg. And you see that right here. This might be just like an interesting little trinket, but taken from its context, it means a lot less. This I'll close with is the most invaluable piece because think about the incredible amount of violence that I presented earlier that was happening on this front line of freedom for Miller Grove. Think about the incredible amount of kidnappings and killings that were happening and selling freed individuals into slavery during this time period. Think about again the intensity of that front line. What really kind of almost still gives me chills is when I've had learners look at this and say, oh, they had children there. They, meaning the residents of Miller Grove, this all African American community with suspected ties to the Underground Railroad, had families there, had families in that front line of freedom, had families in this environment of incredible, incredible violence and danger. In other words, these families were so committed and willing to put themselves and their families in harm's way for a greater good. And that greater good was supporting other freedom seekers. So again, this little piece of doll leg is just a trinket when it's taken out of context, but in its context becomes incredibly important and incredibly invaluable. And as I mentioned, you'll see all of these URLs that are at the bottom of the page. So this URL right here is where you can click on and get access free to, and all of these materials, by the way, are available for free, STL files that you can download and then have set up to be printed. One little quick printing note, since several of you are getting printers, get wood filament. Filament, by the way, just looks like weed eater cord for those of you who don't have 3D printers, but good wood filament because you can paint this and you can sand it and make it look more whatever, authentic, if you will. So you can see the lighter color. This is wood. I used to get like stuff like, you know, like different colors, like this is kind of a goldish color for the harness hook. But I can paint these, not to make them exact replicas, but to get them closer to, of course, what you see from the original. How they do wood filament, I think they must make it out of sawdust. I'm not entirely sure, but look for wood filament. If you're doing glass, this is kind of a quote unquote transparent filament, even though you can't see through it, but it does represent something more like glass, if you will, for your students. So that's incredibly exciting to see even those technologies that are available. All right, we'll go into questions. I'll leave this screen up just so you can get my email there. Because again, if there are questions that we don't get a chance to address, or if you have questions later on when you go to the Educating with Evidence website and want some further clarification on items, please feel free, as I'm sure everyone who has been part of this, you know, consider us resources. We are here to support and here to help you. So I'll open it up to then questions. And I think, yeah, Chelsea, you're going to facilitate those.
Yeah, Grant, thank you so much for this, for all the strategies that you shared with us. We're wondering if you're able to share some of the resource links in the chat with our teachers, and just anyone that's watching, anyone that's in a grant, we will be sharing it with your ed coordinators and curriculum specialists so that they can upload it onto the Canvas, each individual Canvas page as well.
Yeah, I'll try to figure out. I mean I can attempt to. Let me see if I can answer questions as well. I'm using PDF here, so I can go through one by one and grab some of these. I'll
That's
also,
fine.
if you're able to on the website, or even for folks who have registered with their emails, I'm happy to make this like as a PDF available that you can just email to everybody. And
Okay.
that way these resources are in context, if you will. I could start just bombarding you with URLs, but like if you see like, for
Exactly.
instance, this right here, this URL, if you click on it, you'll see an interactive activity that's dedicated to this political cartoon. So I fear that those resources out of context, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, you can choose your
Yeah.
own adventure. I can attempt to do a little bit of that, but I
Don't
fear
worry
that
about
I
it,
will,
Grant. We'll just
yeah,
share it.
perfect. I
So
apologize
we
about that.
have, no, it's okay. So we have a question. What other suggestions or best practices do you have for creating or using 3D printers to generate artifacts for people totally new to using artifacts as primary sources in the classroom?
You see on my phone here, I have 3 cameras. If you have a phone with 3 cameras or 2 cameras, you now have a 3D scanner. So there are free 3D scanning apps that you can get that will allow you to go around an object and create files that are then, in fact, let's see here. Well, it's back there, so I won't move it back there. I've had, so a suggestion is to play around with 3D scanning technology that's free, partner with your local museum with artifacts and 3D scan those, and then turn those into things that you could then print. So we had a few of those. We had at Union County History Museum, they had like these specific little blades, knives that they had for cobblers. They had a couple of other tools that cobblers were using. So just some things that were happening locally there. We 3D scanned from their actual collections. So that's one way to get it. Honestly, I'm hoping, and I'm getting ready to put an article out. I'll probably send it to NCSS for social education. It's kind of also another movement that we need to kind of start with material culture. When I see museums 3D scanning their artifacts, they're kind of looking at these like fun, quote unquote, trinkets. And what I mean by that is like, oh, here's a cool, and this is the title of it, the death mask of Abraham Lincoln, meaning the clay that they utilized, the material that they put on Lincoln's face, and they created this mold. Well, you can 3D print that. It's interesting, but it's not necessarily in the vein of this material culture. So really these kind of archaeological dig sites, we're trying to build more on that. But I guess again, so I kind of, before I go too far down that rabbit hole, 3D scan items, so you could even start with some of the artifacts that we have. We have a Peru project that we're getting ready to put artifacts up online about, and so forth. So look at the Smithsonian. You look at, I mean, one cool thing at the Air and Space Museum, you can even 3D print the wrench that scientists sent to the space station so that they could 3D print that tool in the space station, up orbiting Earth, 3D print that to use that tool on the space station. Because as you can imagine, they're not just going to be able to do a little Amazon delivery up there for a tool that they need. But instead, they sent the file that they could 3D print. You can 3D print that at home. So Air and Space Museum is a good one. Google 3D printed artifacts. That's another way to get into it. But again, if you want to explore, and honestly, if you're not comfortable with 3D scanning, I bet your students would love to just jump in to kind of explore that. So let them take some of the lead on that as well. Ask them and say, hey, apparently we can 3D scan with our phones if we have 2 or more cameras. Can you guys explore that with me? And learn together with your students. Hope that begins to answer the question. But that's some things I could point out offhand.
Man, that makes me miss the classroom. So did you find evidence of books or writing materials when excavating Miller Grove?
Oh, interesting. Evidence of books themselves? No. What's interesting about Miller Grove is a lot of those cabins, because the Miller Grove site is now part of the U.S. Forest Service land. It's the Shawnee National Forest. So it's in the middle of the Shawnee National Forest. What's cool about that is the Forest Service has a team of archaeologists. They have an archaeologist on. So if any of you are near Forest Service land or Bureau of Land Management properties, they will typically have archaeologists who are doing different digs or excavations. So why I bring all of this up is the cabins had been disassembled over the decades, and the wood was utilized for other purposes, and then it was turned into farmland and so forth. So that's why these sites only have barely any foundation stones left. You really are finding a lot of, or we are finding a lot of the artifacts, and archaeologists love trash. Wherever you find things that are discarded, you'll find interesting pieces like, I don't know if I'll be able to find it quickly enough, but you'll find things like this broken piece of a ceramic pipe. You'll find elements of like a hog's tooth, or different examples of what kind of shows different diets that you'll see during these time periods. So no books, because there wasn't really anything left of the cabin. What we did find, and I would love to 3D scan it, but it's tiny, is a piece of printer's type. So the closest thing to a book is a piece of printer's type, meaning, you know, the little pieces of letters that you would use to, back in the day, print books. That's really interesting. And here's why. And again, a little tiny trinket, little piece of printer's type. Now, was that basically just somebody had a little trinket of printer's type and they just had it as a souvenir? Maybe. Did they have the set of those and maybe use them to kind of like learn letters? Maybe. Or was there a printing press there? Was there an opportunity to print false freedom papers? Because if you're a freedom seeker and are journeying through the North, trying to get to Canada, you need to have documentation if you are accosted, if you are questioned for being, you know, a freedom seeker, or thinking of that you are, even though you may be a freed person, you may have never been born into slavery or enslavement. So did Miller Grove with the AME churches partner to make false freedom papers? And did that piece of printer's type, is that an example of that? What I'm pointing out to you is a lot of maybe kind of statements, right? And that's what historical archaeologists do a great job of doing. It's like, we don't know, but here's the evidence that could lean toward this argument of that happening. So no books, but printer's press type, which was super exciting.
Thank you. How have you seen some of these strategies or heard about these strategies being integrated in elementary classrooms?
I would say one really fun part is looking at, especially with material culture. I'll start with that one. You'll see like NCSS, the National Council for the Social Studies. If you have a membership to that organization, you have free access to their archive of past issues. And if you type in archaeology, you'll see a lot of great strategies using artifacts. Simple things like having students bringing in artifacts from maybe their grandparents. And what that could be done to do is to show continuity and change. Here's something that my grandfather used to do X. Do we do that similarly today or not? Do we use a different tool to do that or not? That's one. Another really cool one that I recently saw with a sixth grade teacher is she would set up these, I think she would almost set them up with arranging contemporary artifacts, or even baskets, I think is what she used. And like some would have like a beach towel or suntan lotion. Another one might have a can of soda and a gaming console and so forth. But what she would do is have students say, well, here are the things that we found in this room. What was happening here? And students would be like, oh, it looks like somebody came over to do babysitting because I see this, but I also see children's things. Or, oh, I think that this might be a room, like a kid's room where they're like playing video games. Or, oh, this might be an instance where people are getting ready to go maybe to the beach or something, because I'm seeing beach towels and so forth. And so that's where you're really getting into that concept of material culture. Significance in, again, kind of the mundane. So those would be the two pieces I would say, is like just bringing in artifacts and what they tell us about the past with continuity and change. Like, oh, they used to use X, now we use this. So continuity is we still need to whatever, do something, but the change is we have different tools. Or the other thing is where some things were staged with little baskets and students had to give, you know, kind of descriptions of. Another fun thing is, and you would kind of pre-do the bring in 2 trash barrels and dump them in the room. You might kind of like sort through them in advance, but have somebody say, okay, which one was found from the cafeteria, which one was found from the classroom. And students might notice, oh, there are empty milk cartons here, so that's going to be from a cafeteria. That's a good example of sifting through trash as well. All right. I don't know if we captured very many of them, but as you can see, I'm pretty excited about these different topics and could go on and on about that. I know we're running out of time. Is there a quick one that I can attempt to answer?
Well, I think we've hit a lot of the questions, but I just encourage
Perfect.
people, if they do have a question, you have provided your email here for them, so reach out. I know Grant's happy to answer those. I did also want to put in the chat a link to our, this one, the link that I just provided is for the survey. And then Edge teachers that are still on, we also have a link for you, and this is for our sign-in sheet. Really important that we get you signed in. I'm going to go ahead and put that link in the chat for you too. I'll put that a couple of times there. I just want to say again, thank you so much, Grant, for your work and expertise. I found this was really interesting. We do have a couple of additional webinars coming up. There is one tomorrow, Dining in the Dawn of a Nation, Food and Society in the Federal Era. That is with Cheryl Ann Amendola. I'm going to place that in the chat for anybody that's interested in joining us tomorrow. And then recently, we just had another NCHE webinar added for January 30th. And this one is Geographies of Expansion and Emancipation. So contextualizing episodes of 19th century with US history with web maps. So I feel like there are some GIS and things that are involved in that as well. So that may be interesting to people too. I went ahead and put that in the chat. Again, thank you so much, teachers, for being here with us. Have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your evening.